So, liebe Kommilitoninnen und Kommilitonen, ich begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zur Ringvorlesung Geschichte der Ukraine seit 1991. Bevor ich Ihnen gleich unseren heutigen Gast und den Redner des heutigen Tages, Sergiy Kudelia, vorstelle und dann auch ins Englische wechseln werde, möchte ich Sie gerne noch auf zwei andere Dinge hinweisen. Zum einen diejenigen, die nach der Vorlesung gerne noch etwas mehr von Sergiy Kudelia und auch auf Deutsch lesen wollen, seien auf diese Zeitschrift Religion und Gesellschaft in Ost und West verwiesen, die ich schon vor 2 Wochen auch schon mal angepriesen habe. Das ist die neueste Ausgabe Schlaglicht der Ukraine in Geschichte und Gegenwart. Und darin gibt es auch einen Text von Sergiy Kudelia in deutscher Übersetzung von Moskau orchestriert, Russlands Rolle beim Kriegsausbruch im Donbass 2014. Ich habe auch noch einige Hefte der Zeitschrift mitgebracht und Sie dürfen sich gerne im Anschluss ein Exemplar nehmen, wenn Sie das gerne noch vertiefen wollen. Das ist der eine Hinweis. Und der andere Hinweis, auch dort liegen vorne diese Programme vom Stadtkino Basel aus. Und das Stadtkino Basel wird Anfang November, vom 3. November bis zum 12. November, eine Filmreihe zeigen zum ukrainischen Gegenwartskino, Schatten und Visionen. Und es ist eine recht einmalige Gelegenheit, sich mit den quasi aktuellen Filmschaffen in der Ukraine auseinanderzusetzen. Und ich kann mir sehr gut vorstellen, dass einige von Ihnen daran sehr interessiert sind. Und deswegen liegen vorne auch die Programme aus, die Sie auch an anderen Orten in Basel finden. Aber ich wollte sie jetzt eben speziell weil ich denke, hier in dem Kreis gibt es einige, die an diesem Programm vielleicht besonders Interesse haben könnten. But now I will switch to English. Although Sergiy also understands German, it's not his working language, but I'm sure that he was able to follow what I've just said. But to be more polite, I would like to introduce you in English. It's my great pleasure. It's really my great pleasure, and to welcome Sergiy Kudelia. Not only because he is one of the really outstanding international experts on the war in Ukraine since 2014, but also because he used to be our colleague in Basel. He is a former URIS fellow, and he was in Basel in spring last year when the full-scale invasion of Russia started. And Sergiy was the right man on the spot in Basel. He was here for half a year, and he quite made a career as an expert also in Swiss media, because then Swiss television, Swiss radio, Swiss newspapers, they realized that suddenly we had such an outstanding international expert here in Basel. And apart from working on his research, Sergiy was very much engaged in conversation with journalists and in public events. So Professor Sergiy Kudelia is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University in Texas in the US, where he has been teaching since 2012. He received his bachelor in international relations from Ivan Franko National University in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And then for his MA, he moved to Stanford University, and then afterwards did his PhD in international relations at the Johns Hopkins University. He has also taught at other international universities in Kiev, Toronto, Greifswald, Washington, D.C. He just told us when we had lunch that he was recently in Japan, also invited to a conference. And his research interests relate to political regimes, revolutions, institutional change, and the outbreak and dynamics of armed conflicts, with a special focus on Ukraine. And I think he's probably the most outstanding experts on better understanding what really happened in 2014 in the Donbass. Because he has conducted interviews later on with decision makers in the region, and he has really expertise from research on the ground. And his book about the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2014 is about to be published next year in the US. So the manuscript is ready and is now under peer review at Oxford University Press. But we very much keep our fingers crossed that this will materialize pretty soon. When he was in Basel, he worked on the manuscript of the book that I've just mentioned, but he also gave a class at our university on democracy and autocracy in Ukraine and post-Soviet contexts. And I was just happy to see this wonderful picture of your students and you, everybody very happy about this special experience working with you, Sergiy. And it's wonderful that you came back, currently not from Texas now, but we just had to bring him in from Vienna because he's currently working there, which is great. For when I realized that Sergiy is so close, I immediately invited him to join our lecture series. And as you see already from the first slide, Sergiy will be talking about politics in the time of war, Ukraine's home front. So about this window, this temporal window from 2014 until today, and what does the war mean for politics and society in Ukraine today? Sergiy, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm looking forward to your lecture.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Danke für die Einladung. Ich freue mich, wieder in Basel zu sein. I will give my lecture in English. I will know this language a little bit better than German. But thank you, everyone, for coming today. And I'm glad to see this huge interest in Ukraine continue. And I'm glad to see the Ukraine program at Basel flourishing as it is. And I hope it will continue with the same success. I assume the mic is working, so everything is fine. So today we'll talk about mainly the Ukrainian politics from the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014, so the 10 years already. But I also wanted to give you a little context, because to understand how the war changed Ukrainian politics, you really need to see how Ukrainian political process evolved since 1991. And here I want to make two caveats that are also important to understand today's discussion. First, politics in Ukraine began only 30 plus years ago, so very recently. Of course, we had political movements in Ukraine. We had political ideologies that start from the 19th century. We had political parties in Ukraine that participated in elections in Austro-Hungary, for example. But to have a genuine political process, you need to have an independent state. And for that, of course, that only started 30 years ago. That is important to emphasize because, understandably, politics in Ukraine, in a country that just emerged, is difficult and has been very messy, and has been very unpredictable, as we will see. It is different from Switzerland, for example, because you walk around the streets today, there is an election season. Next weekend, you have elections in Switzerland. And political parties in Switzerland, the names of political parties are the parties that existed for 100 years, some longer than that. So you have a long tradition of political competition. You have stable set of preferences. You have voters who for generations voted for one political party or another. And you have a genuine choice, ideological choice between, for example, the socialists, social democrats, Volkspartei, and so on, right? In Ukraine, we've been learning that for the last 30 years. This is something new, something that we were not really used to. And it also is important as far as institutional development of Ukraine is concerned, because yes, prior to the emergence of Ukraine, you had government, Supreme Council, you had quasi-parliament, but you did not have actual meaningful political institutions that were capable of making independent decisions. And even if you had courts and judges, or you had one political party, these courts, these judges, these political parties did not play the function that they play in a democratic society. So Ukrainians had to build that from scratch as well. And the second point that I want to make as far as the beginning of the lecture is concerned is that there is a lot of discussion about legacies and the divisions within Ukraine. But as I will talk and emphasize today, many of these divisions are either exaggerated or simplified. And so the meaning of these divisions, which were genuine for some time and they had political significance, oftentimes is different from what you hear in the news. And I will talk about that in a second as well. But I want to start with the end point, and that is with today's moment, which I call political intermission. So just an outline of what we're going to discuss today. I will first talk about what I see is happening in Ukraine right now. Then I'll talk about how Ukrainian politics was structured prior to 2014. What was the impact of the first Russian invasion in 2014 in Crimea and Donbass? How Poroshenko and Zelensky responded to the war in Donbass and to the Crimean annexation. And finally, what is happening right now, meaning the long war, the full-scale invasion, and what is the outlook for the future. So let me first start with the end, and that is with today's point. For someone who observed, analyzed Ukrainian politics for the last 20 years, it's a very unusual point in the history of Ukraine, because de facto there is no politics in Ukraine, in the sense of struggle for power is not happening. And that is why we can today think about political intermission. Ukrainians are taking a break from politics in order to fight the war for their own survival, for their own existence. And it's understandable. But this is accompanied by a series of changes that are happening. And it's important to talk about these changes. One of the important changes is that you have the disappearance of public space where politics is discussed and debated. So usually politics in Ukraine is debated either on the squares, through rallies, through public campaigns, or in the media. Media right now in Ukraine is restricted in terms of its coverage. So you don't have independent media outlets that would be providing space for critics or opposition political parties. And you don't have public rallies for obvious reason, right? Issues of security, issues of safety, and so on. You also have a suspended procedural competition, or procedures of political competition are suspended for undefined period of time. What are these procedures? Obviously elections, right? So by the political calendar of Ukraine, we had to have elections next year. Presidential election is coming in March of next year, and then you had to have parliamentary elections as well. The official position of most of experts, analysts, civil society in Ukraine, political parties, is that we should not be holding elections in the moment of war. There is a martial law in Ukraine, so legally you cannot hold elections, but there are many other reasons why you cannot hold elections when a country is fighting such a major war against Russian aggression. I will talk about the logic of this and the possible outcomes of this a little later. In addition to that, of course, you have limitations on civic rights and freedoms. So most basic limitation is people cannot gather for large political rallies anymore. People cannot leave the country anymore. There is freedom of movement that is restricted. Men specifically, women of course can do that, but men are restricted in terms of their movement. There are certain limitations on how and what you can criticize in the media as well. And that leads to questions about how sustainable this situation is, right? And one prominent political scientist in the United States, Jessica Lina Pisano, just published a book recently where she analyzed politics in Ukraine and in Russia through the framework of theater. And she says that instead of just looking at political institutions, we have to analyze how these institutions are operating. And she says the best metaphor to understand politics in Russia and Ukraine over the last 20 plus years is to think about it as a stage where you have public performances, but some of these performances are not genuine, but scripted. And there are real organizers of these performances, of these theatrical stages behind the scenes. So in order to analyze politics in Ukraine or in Russia, you both have to look at what's happening on the frontal stage and at the back. Our stage, of course, was always very vibrant political stage, and it was very loud. We had a lot of actors on the stage. Now there is one actor, right? There is only one actor on that stage that represents Ukraine, both externally and internally. President Zelensky is the face of the Ukrainian defense against the Russian aggression to the world. And he also makes communications and speaks and addresses Ukrainian people at home. But the big question that arises is whether that theater of one, if we use the same metaphor of theater, is something that is temporary or something that actually may be quite long and maybe a permanent feature. And that's something I will return to at the end of today's lecture. But let me first give you, as I said, a brief summary of the main elements or characteristics of Ukrainian political process prior to 2014. And if we try to sort of divide this period of 20 plus years into 4 periods, I would say that we can look at the 1990s as a separate period where the main debates between political actors was whether or not we want to go back to the times of the Soviet Union and restore some form of socialist or communist system, or we want to engage in real, genuine state building, build institutions, and liberalize both politics and the economy. So create a modern democracy and a functioning market economy. This was the central debate that was happening in the 1990s. And you can look at these 2 maps, and I'll show you a couple of maps throughout the lecture, just to appreciate how important communist support for Communist Party and communist ideology was in the 1990s. So on this map, right here on the left, on your side, you see the results of the parliamentary election of 1998. Most of the districts in Ukraine at that time voted for communists. Communists won most of the districts in Ukraine in 1991, the Communist Party. And this is the presidential election of 1999. This is the second round where the incumbent President Kuchma was running against the communist leader Petro Simonenko. And there you see again, a very significant part of Ukraine, central Ukraine, southern Ukraine, parts of eastern Ukraine, also voted for a communist leader. And in fact, the results of these elections were not absolutely clear and easily predictable. And I remember because I was already a graduate student at that time when this election was happening. And the election was actually quite close. And there are only several reasons why incumbent President Kuchma managed to defeat the communist opposition challenger in 1999. One of these reasons, of course, is that he managed to mobilize the resources, financial resources of his business oligarchic backers. He controlled the media, so there was a lot of positive coverage on the media. There was also an attempt by Kuchma to divide the Eastern electorate. Kuchma himself was a Russophone. So as you can see, parts of Eastern Ukraine, for example, Dnipropetrovsk and parts of Donetsk Oblast also voted for Kuchma. And of course, there was an old-fashioned, at that time, tactic of ballot rigging. So there was a lot of electoral falsification as well in 1999 election that allowed Kuchma to prevail. But 1999, that victory, even though it was achieved not through perfect democratic means, as I just described, became also a turning point where Ukraine moved away from this debate whether we go back to the Soviet times and restore communism to a new type of debate. And that debate was between autocracy and democracy. Because as I just suggested, Kuchma managed to consolidate a lot of control over the state resources. He got support from oligarchic backers, and he decided to move on and consolidate authoritarian regime in Ukraine fully. As a result, the period of early 2000s up until 2004 was a period where you have strong opposition movement in Ukraine that emerges in order to stop consolidation of autocracy around President Kuchma. That period ends in 2004 with the Orange Revolution. I'm sure you have discussed that in this course already. And then the third period is the period where suddenly those actors that were associated with the authoritarian politics of Kuchma reinvent themselves and they become Democrats. But instead of running as Democrats on the pro-Western platform, they're running as Democrats or pluralists on a pro-Russian platform. And of course, the leader of this movement, of this political party, Party of Regions, was Viktor Yanukovych. His main goal, his main idea, which was, as we understand now, designed also by American political technologist Paul Manafort, was a key strategies behind his campaign. And he talks about this in his memoirs openly. And he says, when I came to Ukraine, I realized that we can win a significant support of Ukrainian people if we present the contest not between democracy and autocracy, but between the rights of some Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, Ukrainian speakers, and the rights of Russophones, Russian speakers, whose language rights should be protected. And so this leads to the reinvention of some of the political forces in Ukraine that emerge as protectors of the interests of the regions. So they argue for a more decentralized system of government, and the protectors of the interests of the Russian speakers, that is southern and eastern Ukraine, where you have predominantly Russophone Ukrainian population at that time. And so the debates in politics up until 2014 focused on this question, the question of what type of nation are we going to create? The one that is focused primarily on defending and being more ethnocentric, or the one that is that protects the rights of Russian speakers and gives significant degree of autonomy to individual regions. And final debate that ended also in 2014 was, of course, in 2010, when Yanukovych becomes president. He reorients Ukraine in the direction of greater integration with Russia. That reorientation happens gradually, but ultimately it peaks in 2013 when the association agreement with the European Union is not signed, and he signs instead a major economic agreement with Putin. That debate also has been part of Ukrainian politics for some time, but it became particularly pronounced in 2010, primarily because in Ukraine for a long time, from Kuchma onwards, there was a consensus among political elites that most of the political elites, that we need to move in the direction of the European Union. And in fact, it was under Kuchma that Ukraine for the first time mentioned that it wants to be member not just of the European Union, but of NATO. Yanukovych changes that and instead introduces the concept of non-alignment or neutrality, where Ukraine is no longer seeking membership in NATO, but instead is trying to become neutral or non-aligned. In reality, though, non-alignment meant closer relationship with Russia economically. Now, when we think about how politics was conducted in Ukraine, of course, a lot of political struggles were focused on individuals. So when you try to, and I'm avoiding dropping a lot of names on you, I'm just trying to let you think in more general terms, but most of the political projects were personalistic in nature. So it was not about ideologies, but it was about a leader of a specific political party. And voters were responding to the characteristics of the leader more than particular ideological appeals that they made. As a result, ideology was used by many political actors in Ukraine opportunistically. So today you're a communist, tomorrow you're a nationalist. Today you're a liberal, tomorrow you're voting for taking a more status position. You're basically changing your views depending on the type of election you think you're running, the type of voters you're going to appeal to, and also importantly, depending on what some of your financial backers are telling you. And this is another important point to understand about Ukrainian politics, is that many political parties, projects, leaders are invented by business leaders, by oligarchs, major business leaders who view this political project as an investment that will bring them potentially a lot of returns, either in the form of protection of their businesses, or maybe adding to their businesses, gaining new revenues, etc. And finally, voting itself, especially in the early period of Ukrainian independence, was a form of short-term transaction where voters were not necessarily making a conscious choice about what exactly the political program that they like is what they're going to support, but they're responding oftentimes to material incentives in the form of bribes, in the form of coercion. So it's not just financial incentives, but also coercion coming from your employers. For example, many large industries or factories in Ukraine, their bosses would tell people how to vote. You vote for this party or that, depending on the kind of deal or agreement that the bosses of these factories make with voters. So voting itself was not an expression of a democratic preference by voters, but as a result of the short-term calculation of a particular benefit. And just to illustrate the lack of this, the level of competitiveness of Ukrainian politics, this is the graph that shows you the results of presidential elections from 1991 to 2019. And as you can see, in most of the elections, presidential elections, in the first round, the winner would get around 30% of the vote. That is 1/3 of the vote. That means, with the exception of 1991 and 2014, and the second candidate would get a result that is pretty close. So that illustrates both the lack of dominant political actors in Ukraine throughout the political history of Ukraine, and also the level of competitiveness of Ukrainian politics, which is quite unique for the post-Soviet space. So it's important to keep in mind that even though we are talking about all these difficulties and elements, dirty elements of Ukrainian politics that are certainly not democratic, but compared to other former Soviet republics, most of the former Soviet republics, Ukraine actually moved very quickly along the process of democratization. Was Ukraine a democracy? And this is a big question today because you hear politicians, historians, etc., talk about the war today as the war between democracy and autocracy. In general sense, they are right. But from the political science standpoint, of course, Ukraine was never a democracy, was never a full-fledged democracy. It met the procedural requirements for democracy in terms of holding regular elections, and this is an important requirement, that were relatively competitive. So procedurally, it was minimally a democratic state with some exceptions. 1999, as I already mentioned, and also 2002, in these presidential elections, there was considerable fraud committed. But in general, minimal requirements for democracy, Ukraine fulfilled. But of course, broader, if you talk about democracy in the broader sense, Ukraine was not fulfilling these requirements. So we had consistent censorships of the media, different periods in time where you have a lot of harassment of the journalists, even killing of the journalists that happened over the last 30 years. We had many instances where opposition leaders, political parties were pressured or persecuted, either through the judicial means or through some informal means. Obviously, we had no rule of law, so there was no independent judiciary. Judges were under political pressure. Government officials were also always dependent on some type of political control, and they were used as political instruments as well. And I already talked about the bribing that often happened, unfortunately, during the elections as well. And this graph represents or demonstrates that from the political science standpoint, Ukraine may fit with the description of a hybrid regime that combined elements of a democracy like elections, regular elections, but also experienced significant violations of many democratic freedoms. And as you can see, if you look at the max category of democracy at the top, so Switzerland probably is somewhere at the top here, and minimal, like North Korea, somewhere at the very bottom, or Saudi Arabia, Ukraine has consistently been somewhere in the middle in terms of its performance. And what's strange, you may think is strange about this graphic, is that there is very little change. Right? So 30 years from 1992 to 2020, practically right to the beginning of the war, Ukrainian democracy remained competitive, but there was no breakthrough to full-fledged democratic governance. Now, there are several reasons why, and political sciences debate why Ukraine was pluralistic, more pluralistic than other post-Soviet states. But I will mention just two very important factors that I think are critical to understanding pluralism in Ukraine. One is regionalism, something that I already touched on very briefly, and that is the differences between regions, both in terms of their ethnic compositions, but also in terms of, probably more important, in terms of their historical experience. Parts of Ukraine, as you know from this course already, were of course under Russian Empire, parts were under Austro-Hungarian Empire, then under Hungary, Poland, Romania, etc. And these periods of control of different parts of Ukraine by different states had a direct influence on the people who lived there, and they influenced their political choices. But what's more important is that at some point, when political parties and leaders understood that there is this significant regional variation within Ukraine as far as preferences are concerned, they decided to politicize these preferences. So it's one thing to have a regionally diverse country, right? Many countries are very regionally diverse. But it's another thing when political actors consciously emphasize these regional differences and run on trying to put one side of the country with another, or trying to create some kind of internal conflict in order to benefit from it politically. And these two maps demonstrate how this regional differences in 2002, variations in different parts of Ukraine, ultimately led to the consolidation of two blocks, right? So oftentimes you hear in Ukraine is divided between East and West. Obviously, it's much more complex because as you see on this is the graph on the left, parliamentary election results in 2002, you see that the Western Ukraine itself is divided between different regions. So you have Galicia voting for National Democratic parties. You have Transcarpathian region, which was, you have a Hungarian minority there that has been voting for some of the political parties that also Eastern Ukrainians supported. You also have Bukovina and Bessarabia that voted differently, and there is a lot of variation in the center. So 2002 is the period where the regional divide is not clear, as clear-cut as you see on this map, precisely because political parties were not intentionally using these regional differences. But once the Orange Revolution happens, Ukrainian voting pattern transforms into a clear split between, you see, eastern and southern regions of Ukraine that start to vote for one single party, that is Party of Regions, and central and western Ukraine, with the exception of Transcarpathia, as you can see there, that starts to vote for more pro-Western political forces, either led by Viktor Yushchenko, Our Ukraine, or Batkivshchina, led by Yulia Tymoshenko. That is not the natural outcome. That is the result of intentional political strategies by political actors, basically to capitalize on the differences that exist between the regions. And finally, the second very important driver of pluralism is oligarchic capitalism. As I already explained, major oligarchy groups have been investing in political parties for quite some time. And prior to 1999, basically oligarchs themselves emerged only in the period of the 1999, sorry, in the period of the 1990s. Prior to 1999 election, they were investing or supporting primarily the president. But after 1999 election, something changes and oligarchs start to invest in different political projects with the expectation of either growing their business or getting additional assets or destroying their opponents, competitors. Because if you support a political party that ultimately wins and you control the leader of this party, that leader may help you with your business in a very significant way. What's interesting is that attempts at redistribution of wealth, even though oligarchs really insisted on, some of them wanted to capture some of the assets of the other oligarchs, never really succeeded. There were some changes of assets from one group to another, but in general terms, the very same oligarchs that emerged in Ukraine in the 1990s, and you can count them 3, 4, 5 people, who made their money on primarily either energy trade or metallurgy, exist up until this point, not at least prior to the war. These are the same, exactly the same people. And finally, let me move now to the stage of contemporary politics that starts in 2014. under the war. And it's important to understand the change in the context of these two attempts of authoritarian consolidation. So in one attempt, when certain political actors try to limit pluralism in Ukraine and turn Ukraine into autocracy, happens in the period of 2003-2004, where Kuchma tries to organize a presidential election that will transfer power to Yanukovych. The second attempt of authoritarian consolidation happens in 2013-14, where Yanukovych is thinking about the second term. He is president already. And the way he is going about this is by basically repressing the opposition, putting his main opposition leader, Yulia Tymoshenko, behind bars in jail, and trying to go after some of the other businesses that are supporting the opposition as well. So these are two attempts when there is political actors are trying to transform Ukrainian very flawed democratic system into fully authoritarian system. And what's interesting is that in both of these attempts, you have the same actors that play a significant role. Okay, so you have Putin that both in 2004 election and in 2014 election supports Yanukovych, right? And tries to somehow push Ukraine in a more pro-Russian direction. You have Ukrainian oligarchs that are split. Some support Yanukovych, some support pro-Western political forces. And you have regional elites that also try to use these moments of rupture in Ukrainian politics for their benefits. And you also have, and that's, I think, another very interesting pattern, the same response from the society, where people, instead of accepting this attempt of authoritarian consolidation, go out on the streets and protest until it stops, right? Until they succeed in reversing this process of authoritarian control. That's why we have two democratic revolutions in Ukraine. One happens in 2004, another in 2014. These are all responses of the society to attempts to consolidate autocracy. But the outcomes of these revolutions and attempts, unfortunately, were very different, right? So the first outcome resulted in a peaceful transition of power in 2004, where the power went to opposition leader. And there was an agreement between all major actors about how politics will be structured in the future. 2014, you have a violent rupture where instead of an agreement and compromise, parts of the Ukrainian elites flee the country because they believe that they already stole enough and they cannot make any deals anymore. That's fine, they just leave, right? Yanukovych and the entire government flees the country in a matter of hours. But you also have a second element, and that is Putin decides, instead of from standing back, decides to intervene in Ukraine and use the moment of weakness in order to capture parts of Ukrainian territory and then start conflict in Donbass. So the rupture in Ukrainian politics that happens as a result of the invasion of Russia in 2014 is the result of several factors. So, of course, we have to first accept the idea that Russia was the one that tried to break the process, the normal process of politics that was developing in Ukraine over the previous 23 years. But the result of the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass is, first of all, the change in the composition of the electorate. So Ukraine immediately loses about 3 million people. They're cut off from Ukrainian politics, even more than, of course, than 3 million, because if you count even in 2014 election, most of the voters in Donbass did not participate in that election in May because there was already violence happening. And that means that these close results that we've seen up until now, and you saw that this first, second place very close in Ukraine, suddenly you have a shift in political power to the pro-Western national democratic forces. So that is the result of the change in the composition of the electorate, because most of the voters that were cut off politics from Ukrainian politics were residing in regions that consistently voted for pro-Russian political forces. The second important change that the Russian invasion produces is the elimination of very important dividing line. Okay, it's called in political science, it's called cleavage. I'm not sure how it's translated into German correctly, but basically it's this division that politicians use in order to accumulate votes, to bring in voters to their side. And a very important division that existed prior to that, as I already showed, was the division of the choice between Russia and the West, so geopolitical division, and the division on whether you want to support the rights of Russian speakers, Russian language should become a regional language or official language, or you want to build a nation around Ukrainian ethnicity, Ukrainian language, etc. That is called a geocultural cleavage. That cleavage becomes much weaker because more Ukrainians start to associate themselves with the pro-Western choice, and more Ukrainians start to embrace a more ethnocentric vision of the future of Ukrainian nation. They start speaking Ukrainian language. They embrace the historical narratives that are based on the significance of Ukrainian national resistance and struggle in the Soviet period and before that, etc. And as a result, we see the weakening of both flanks among political parties. So on the right, you see the division among political forces because now they compete for a larger piece of the electorate. And on the left and also among the pro-Russian political parties, you have the disappearance of some projects. So for example, Communist Party that I mentioned that was about to win the elections in 1999 actually is banned and disappears. So there is no Communist Party in Ukraine anymore from 2014. The left itself, the leftist political forces do not exist in Ukraine, primarily because, and here I want to emphasize that the reason why it's happened, and this is something I researched in for my book, is that communist officials played a very important role in organizing and supporting Russian invasion of Donbass. And the key collaborators of Russians in Donbass, some of the key collaborators were members of the Communist Party. So that's the reason, the basis why communists were banned as a party and the leftist political forces do not exist. That leads to this map of 2014. You see a very different map where you have more divergence in the preferences, and you see there is no longer this unity in either central and western regions or southern and eastern regions as to what political parties they are going to support. So the map is becoming very different. Now let's talk a little about the shift that happens both internally and externally as a result of the war in Donbass, because the war in Donbass really starts sometime in the summer of 2014. It becomes very violent in the next several months. Ultimately, it loses its intensity sometime around late 2015 and continues as what is called low intensity conflict up until 2022. The direct influence or impact of the Donbass war on the Ukrainian politics is the strengthening of the center-right political parties and a change in the agenda or policy agenda that becomes more centered on what is called ethnocentric nation building. So the idea that the Ukrainian ethnicity, Ukrainian nation, it should be formed or should be composed based on the principles of prevalence of Ukrainian language, based on the Ukrainian church, and Poroshenko ultimately succeeds in creating or overcoming the divide between Orthodox churches in Ukraine and creating a national church that is united for all Ukrainians, unified, and revising the history of Ukraine in a way that exposes the crimes that were committed against Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian people, both by the Russian Empire and by the Soviet Union. Another important change that happens in terms of electoral geography is the basically disappearance of large regions that vote for pro-Russian political parties. And as a result, you only have cities where you have large significant support still remains for pro-Russian political parties. Cities like Kharkiv and Odessa, these are two primary cities where there is still significant, was at that time, support for pro-Russian political parties. And parts of Donbass that was not occupied also continued to vote for pro-Russian political forces. But overall, in Ukraine, you see a greater variation in terms of the types of political parties that would gain support. And a final very important change, of course, is the empowerment of civil society. Because one of the reasons why ultimately Ukraine in 2014 managed to prevent the full capture of Donbass, which could have happened in 2014 because Ukrainian army at that time was extremely weak, and the West was not willing to support Ukraine in any practical manner other than statements and declarations of support. So now we see, of course, the significant military assistance that comes from the West and Europe. But 2014, Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, they were all afraid that somehow Russia will start fighting America or start fighting Germany if they provide weapons to Ukrainians. So they remained on the sidelines, just issued declarations of support. And what helped Ukraine to prevent full capture of Donbass and possibly other regions of Ukraine by Russia was civil society, where individual people volunteered into groups, into military groups, battalions, formed battalions, provided all kinds of civilian support for these battalions, and ultimately helped to stop, through this joint effort, stop Russian invasion. And there was also a rise in the non-governmental organizations that received significant support from the West that started to play a significant role, quite significant influence over policymaking in Kiev. And this is the external dimension that I wanted to turn to right now. So on one hand, you see a significant shift in the fact that most of political actors in Ukraine suddenly support not just EU membership, but NATO membership. Prior to 2014, there was a big divide among politicians whether or not Ukraine should become a member of NATO. And that divide was reflected also in public opinion. People were all for European Union in Ukraine, significant support. But NATO, about 30% of Ukrainians were willing to see Ukraine in NATO. So there was reluctance. 2014 changes that. Once we identify that Ukraine is under attack from Russia, that Ukraine faces a significant danger, public opinion in Ukraine shifts in the direction of NATO, over 60% and higher support NATO membership. And that, of course, forces political parties to generally support pro-NATO position. There is also significant leverage that the West suddenly acquires over Ukraine because Ukraine is weakened economically because of the war. It starts to receive significant economic assistance from the United States and from the European Union, and that gives the Western leaders leverage over reform process. So even though Poroshenko, who becomes president in 2014, maybe not necessarily very enthusiastic about some of the political reforms that would have to limit his power, like the introduction of anti-corruption bureaus, for example, ultimately because the Western leaders were imposing or putting up these demands to make changes and reforms in the corruption sphere, Poroshenko agrees to move with it. And that pressure is very important. And another change that happens on the external front is the change in the relationship with Russia. So although diplomatic relations are not broken completely, they're not stopped, Ukraine takes away the most important lever that Russia and Putin had over Ukraine, that is gas, energy. Many of the Ukrainian oligarchs benefited from gas trade with Russia. Through a lot of corruption, through a lot of kickbacks, they also corrupted political elites. And so the way Moscow was capable of controlling Ukrainian politicians is through these businessmen oligarchs that they used to help with the trade in gas, who would then finance certain political parties and political leaders who would then be doing fulfilling certain services to Russia. But Ukraine has not fully, so we cut off all gas supplies from Russia, we reoriented to the European Union, but Ukraine has not fully cut off all channels of public influence, and one important channel of public influence, of public opinion influence remains, and that is media. Okay, so interestingly, under Poroshenko, you have the emergence of a media conglomerate that consists of 3 or 4 television channels that were all funded from one source. A man named Viktor Medvedchuk, who is famous as, has a very close relationship to Vladimir Putin for a long time, since 2000s. He had a very close relationship to Putin. He creates these media channels, but he receives money out of the business deals with Russia. So most of the funding for these media channels go from Russia through Medvedchuk. and he is capable of taking these media channels over. And that remains a key lever of Russian influence over public opinion in Ukraine. And I will talk about the significance of that in a second. But let me very briefly stop here on the issue of Donbass, because the war in Donbass becomes the central issue in political debates in Ukraine up until 2022. And the question is this: the political debate that was happening in Ukraine is the following: whether or not we have to provide Donbass with autonomy, and so create a full-fledged canton of Donbass, which would have its own referendums, full power, etc., like you have in Switzerland, that would only exist by itself, right? No other regions would have this significant power as Donbass. Or we try to decentralize authority and give all regions exactly the same type of powers that would give them an opportunity, for example, to use finances for their own benefit, right? And use some of the tax revenues to build up roads and schools, etc. But this would be equal powers to everyone, right? But the Kyiv would retain a veto over some of the decisions that the regions would make. Ukraine's position was, we will give Donbass as much power as all other regions in Ukraine. This is how we settle the war. Russian position, you have to give Donbass additional privileges. That means that Donbass has to have their own police, they have to have their own judges, they have their own political parties, and most importantly, they should be able to have foreign relations with Russia. So if most of Ukraine joins European Union and NATO, Donbass can suddenly say, well, actually, we don't like NATO EU so much. We want to have our special relationship with Russia, right? That was the essence of the disagreement that was happening in the Minsk, in context of the Minsk talks. So as you understand, Donbass autonomy, concession to Russia on the issue of autonomy, presented very significant costs to Ukraine as far as its future, because it would have first blocked possibly Ukrainian integration with the European Union and NATO. That's number one. And second, even more important probably, is it would have destabilized Ukraine from within. Because once you have Donbass autonomy, you have your own militia, you have your own armed groups, then it means that these armed groups may represent threat to other regions, and maybe some other regions would want to have their own militia groups as well, right? So that would risk the breakup of Ukraine, the autonomy to Donbass. That is the reason why Ukrainian leaders, both Poroshenko, Zelensky, never agreed to this proposition. But for Russia, of course, Donbass autonomy gives huge benefits. It would give them a lever to influence Kyiv, right? They can always blackmail Kyiv using their proxies in Donbass. And it allows Russia to, in a way, block Ukrainian integration with the West. So ultimately, this idea that you can maintain a degree of conflict in Donbass that will be low intensity, very few casualties, but it will go on. It turns out to be, it was preferable for Ukrainian elites, but it certainly was, over the long term, not preferable for Russia, because this is not the outcome that they were seeking. They wanted to integrate Donbass on the terms of autonomy. The second best option for them, if that does not succeed, take over and move on with the full force. And that's what happens in 2022. Very briefly, there was also, of course, divergence in public opinion on the issue of concessions. Some people viewed differently what Donbass conflict represents. Some people viewed it as a civil war. Majority viewed it as, of course, a form of Russian aggression. But that means that within political elites, there was also disagreement whether we want to make compromises with Moscow. And there were certain political parties that advocated for compromise versus defiance. Now, what's interesting about Zelensky is that he opposed Poroshenko. Poroshenko took a position of defiance and rejection of Putin, right? Zelensky takes a position that is very ambiguous in 2019 election, and he says, yes, I will also oppose Putin, but I'm ready to negotiate with him, and we can actually make a deal. So ironically, Zelensky, the war leader of today, was a very different man as a presidential candidate. And that allowed him, in a way, to build a very large coalition in support, where he was appealing both to people who wanted to defy Russia and also those people who wanted to make a compromise with Russia. So when we think about the elections of 2014, 2019, the election of Poroshenko was a formation of alliance within Ukraine to prevent the breakdown of the state. 2019, when the election of Zelensky happens, it was an alliance to change the way the state is governed, because large number of people over Poroshenko presidency became disillusioned with Poroshenko's ability to produce significant reforms. And most importantly, Poroshenko was viewed as extremely corrupt. And he was, most likely. As a result, Zelensky, in his very famous stadium debate, which you might have seen, addresses directly Poroshenko and challenges him on this issue of corruption. So there were significant similarities between the elections of 2014 and 19. We see a practically fully elimination of cross-regional differences. So you see, this is the map of Ukraine in 2014 election, overwhelming support for Poroshenko everywhere. You don't see, with some exceptions in the East and in the South. And this is the 2019 map, support for Zelensky in the second round. You also see overwhelming support for one candidate. You don't see regional differences, with the exception of my native city of Lviv, which voted for Poroshenko. And the region of Lviv was the only region that voted for Poroshenko in 2019 election. But both candidates, both Poroshenko and Zelensky, had business ties. Poroshenko was an oligarch himself. Zelensky obviously was running with the help of Ihor Kolomoisky, which was a very significant oligarch from the 1990s, and he received backing from his television channels. These were similarities, but the differences were also significant. The 2014 election was a strategic election. People voted to prevent the collapse of the state. They didn't care whether it's Poroshenko or someone else. Poroshenko was just the most likely candidate to win. 2019 was a protest vote against Poroshenko. We don't care whom we vote for. We just don't want Poroshenko to stay in power. It was also one of those elections that became anti-establishment elections. So Poroshenko presents himself in 2014 as someone who has experience, who was part of Ukrainian political elite for a while. That gives him trust of the public. We can trust him in the moment of war. So establishment connection of Poroshenko played a positive role for him in 2014. But 2019 was very different. As Zelensky himself said to Trump, I'm your biggest student. He said it to Donald Trump in this very famous or infamous phone conversation that we read a transcript of. So Zelensky runs this populist anti-establishment campaign where he presents himself as a person outside of politics and ridicules all the political class. And of course, 2019 is also the election where all the elites are removed and the new generation of politicians in Ukraine come to power. In general, though, even though you have these significant differences between Poroshenko and Zelensky, I would say the common feature is a lot of continuity between Poroshenko and Zelensky. So many feared, and this is, by the way, a very famous poster from 2019 election, where Poroshenko presents himself as the only leader who can stand up to Putin in Ukraine. Okay, so the choice, Poroshenko said, was between me and Putin. Of course, his rival was Zelensky, but he said Zelensky is just is a replica of Putin. And many people in Western Ukraine, by the way, believe that Zelensky will sell off Ukraine. But in a way, Zelensky surprised everyone because he continued some of the same policies that Poroshenko adopted. And even though he talked as a compromise figure, and he said, yes, I can make a deal with Putin and negotiate with him when he was a candidate, but then he meets with him in Paris, and you remember, it leads to nothing. And instead, at the press conference, Zelensky keeps smiling and ridiculing Putin. He doesn't publicly, but he keeps smiling whenever Putin says that you will need to give Donbass an autonomy. And some of the policies of Zelensky were actually much more hardline than policies of Poroshenko. Poroshenko was the one who tolerated Medvedchuk for quite some time, who allowed Medvedchuk to build up this pro-Russian media conglomerate. Zelensky was the one who went after the media conglomerate, shut down all the television stations, put Medvedchuk into jail, right? So he, in a way, was willing to go much further in terms of defying Putin than Petro Poroshenko. For better or for worse. I mean, there is a debate on whether this was a smart thing to do or not, but for better or worse, there was this change. But in a way, many of the other things remain. So corruption persists under both Poroshenko and under Zelensky. In Poroshenko, all corruption went into the pocket of Poroshenko. Under Zelensky, there are lots of evidence that there is a corruption in his close circle among the people that he surrounds himself in presidential office. But what's worse, in my view, is that under Poroshenko, you had power sharing. So Poroshenko had to share power with a number of influential figures around him, and he held these constant talks. There were 7 or 8 figures that he had to consult with. Zelensky does not consult with anyone. In his first 2 years, he centralizes power in his hands, and in a way, the country that constitutionally, Ukraine is a parliamentary presidential system where parliament and government have to play a significant role. Ukraine becomes, under Zelensky, de facto, a hyper-centralized, hyper-presidential system. And that leads to the decline in the level of democracy performance in Ukraine under Zelensky. As you can see, this is the source, the Economist Democracy Index, actually downgraded Ukrainian democracy during the first 2 years of Zelensky. Okay. Finally, of course, we go from 2019, where Poroshenko can stand up to Putin, to 2022, where Zelensky actually stands up to Putin and says, no inch more. And in fact, all of the territories that Ukraine lost have to be recovered. So in this sense, of course, Zelensky proved that he is very strong and capable leader who would not be betraying Ukrainian national interests. Now, to the point of the current and the future, and let me just very briefly say, since we are almost out of time, let me say a few things. I already mentioned that one of the implications of the war, especially since 2022, is the removal of institutional checks on the president, where you don't have any influence on the presidency by the parliament, by the government, by the courts, etc. President becomes the main, most important actor. That means the policy agenda is set by the president. That means that the state, in a way, starts to dominate the society in Ukraine right now in a way that it has never dominated. There is only one group of people that are allowed to publicly criticize the president, and that is the military. So even not the top military, but you see a lot of criticism, you read a lot of criticisms of the president and his entourage from middle-level officers who criticize corruption in Ukraine, who criticize the slowness of provision of military supplies, etc. But apart from the military, no one else can criticize the president. And when just last week, the terrible terrorist attack on Israel happens, and you have this tragedy that is unfolding in Israel and in the Middle East right now, what is the response of Benjamin Netanyahu? Well, he forms a unity government. He brings in political opposition to his side and creates a government that includes his opponents and critics. But interestingly, Zelensky does not do this. He, in fact, tells all the opposition leaders in Ukraine just to shut up and never criticize him, right? And excludes them from political process whatsoever, and in fact keeps centralizing power in his hands. You can argue whether this is the right thing to do or negative thing, bad thing to do. We can discuss this in the Q&A, but this is a very important change that is happening. And the only legitimacy that he really acquires right now is the legitimacy of the wartime leader, and that is very important. There are also changes that are happening on the regional level. So you have a lot of displacement of the people from the east and the south. Clearly, all the regional patterns that we've talked so far in Ukraine no longer exist. They're not relevant. Oligarchs lose a lot of money because of the war, because many of their factories are destroyed completely. Billions of dollars in assets are lost, Akhmetov, Pinchuk, and others. As a result, the old oligarchic rule is also over. So you don't have the same pattern of influence by the oligarchs. Public trust is also different right now. Just public opinion last week showed that the most trustworthy individuals in Ukraine are members of the military and the security sector. So before, up to 2014, security sector was one of the least trusted. Now, armed forces and SBU among the most trusted in Ukraine, the most trusted. And finally, of course, society has much less influence over the state than it ever had, I would say, in the history of Ukraine. So to summarize what I think would be the long-term impact of the war, and this is something that we can discuss in the Q&A, just two options. One option, of course, is if Ukraine wins. And if that victory is happening relatively in the short term, in the next several years, what's going to happen then to Ukrainian politics? I would say that we have to tame our optimism. And that is my general conclusion based on what I'm seeing. First of all, I think the revival of many democratic institutions will not be guaranteed, at least from the standpoint of the continuity of presidential rule. I think the incentive for Zelensky and for the people around him would be to maintain that strong presidential system that de facto emerged in Ukraine, not de jure, but de facto. And so the institutional checks that I said were removed may not necessarily immediately come back. The society will have to fight for the return of these institutions. Second important point is that the democratic values within the society after a long war may not necessarily be there. I'm not sure whether people would necessarily want to have a democracy in a state where you have a destroyed economy and where you need to have very quick process of economic reconstruction. There is a big question, once Ukraine wins, what's going to happen to people who lived on occupied territories in Donbass, in Crimea, etc. And there is already discussion that people who lived in Crimea or Donbass will be limited in their constitutional rights. That means they cannot vote for 10, 15, 20 years, maybe never. And of course, there is a big question what to do with collaborators, because by Ukrainian law, there has been a new law adopted on collaboration. It's not that just you have to take up arms and fight the Ukrainian side to be a collaborator. You can be a teacher in the school, you can be a medical professional, a doctor in the hospital, and work under the occupying regime, and you will be considered a collaborator and prosecuted based on that law, right? So that means that the way the state, Ukrainian state, will handle this may produce very significant new divisions within the Ukrainian society. There is a genuine, normal, understandable desire for restoration of justice, right, by the people who have been victimized by the war. But there are also concerns whether or not this restoration of justice, this restorative system of justice, may violate significantly, go well beyond what's normal and may violate rights of individuals in the long term. And finally, an outcome of a stalemate, which is being more and more discussed, I would say, in the Western media, the possibility that this war will suddenly become a long war or forever war, where both sides are strong enough, and we've seen that Russia managed to sustain the positions despite the Ukrainian counteroffensive and significant support of the West. There has been no breakthrough. Unfortunately, that would be as significant as happened last year on the front lines. So many are considering this possibility. And of course, the question of what's going to happen to elections, to democracy, to pluralism, to political institutions, they, in the case of the stalemate, are not answered. They're not clearly answered by Zelensky. And I'm one of those who think that, of course, elections cannot be possible under the current circumstances. But I think it's one thing just to say, let's wait until the end of the war, which is what Zelensky says. I'll be the leader until the end of the war. But if the war goes on forever, for a very long time, if we still cannot retain Crimea or Donbass, does it mean that all of the civic rights will be limited up until this time and that there will be no elections under no circumstances? That, I think, is highly problematic as far as lack of clarity about the time when the democracy can be at least partially restored in Ukraine. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.